The plane was calm, gliding steadily above the clouds. Most passengers were quietly absorbed in their own worlds, some scrolling through phones, some dozing, and others staring out the window at the endless sky below. It seemed like any other ordinary flight, until a sudden, loud commotion shattered the peace. A drunken man had been drinking before takeoff, and now his alcohol-fueled arrogance had reached a peak. He stood abruptly in the aisle, slurring his words, waving his arms as if the entire cabin belonged to him. "Who do you think you are?"
"Move aside,"
he shouted at anyone who dared sit in his way. The flight attendants rushed over, their calm professionalism contrasting sharply with his raucous behavior. "Sir, please take your seat," one attendant said, trying to maintain a steady voice. But the drunk ignored her. He leaned over to the nearest passenger, nearly spilling drinks and knocking over magazines. "Don't tell me what to do. I'm in charge here." His laughter rang through the cabin, irritating everyone nearby. Some passengers tried to turn away, shielding themselves from his erratic movements. Others quietly recorded the chaos on their phones, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. In the midst of all this, one passenger remained completely calm. He was sitting a few rows ahead, quietly observing the scene without any hint of alarm. Jeans, a simple jacket, and an air of absolute composure marked his presence. No bodyguards, no cameras, no dramatics. Just a man watching the storm unfold with steady eyes. It didn't take long for passengers to notice him. There was something different, something magnetic in the way he carried himself. Even as the drunk continued to shout and disrupt, this man's calmness seemed to draw the room's attention, almost like a silent gravity. Suddenly, the drunk noticed him too. He squinted, leaning closer with a mocking grin.
"Hey."
"You think you're better than me? Who do you think you are?" The cabin went tense. Conversations stopped. Phones froze mid-recording. Even the flight attendants hesitated, sensing that the situation had reached a tipping point. Everyone's eyes were on this silent figure, the one who didn't react with fear, anger, or annoyance. And then, just as quickly as the chaos began, a subtle shift started to happen. The air felt different. People held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Something told them that within the next few seconds, the ordinary rules of the cabin, the normal power of loudness, arrogance, and chaos, were about to be completely rewritten. No one knew it yet, but this 30-second confrontation would become the most unforgettable moment of the flight. Before we continue, comment below. Have you ever seen someone completely fearless in a tense situation? How did it make you feel? The flight had started like any ordinary journey. Passengers settled into their seats, the hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop. Some flipped through magazines, others typed away on laptops, and a few simply stared out the window, watching clouds drift lazily beneath the plane. Everything seemed routine, calm, almost mundane. That is, until the drunk passenger made his presence known. He had boarded the plane with a swagger, already smelling faintly of alcohol. At first, his loud chatter seemed almost harmless, a nuisance to some, amusing to others. But as the plane reached cruising altitude, it became clear that this man's arrogance and intoxication would escalate. He began shouting at passengers near him, demanding that seats be moved, yelling at the flight attendants for what he called slow service, and mocking anyone who tried to remain calm. Flight attendants moved quickly but cautiously, their training evident in every word and gesture. "Sir, please, take your seat," one repeated, her voice calm yet firm. "I won't sit. You can't tell me what to do," the drunk man roared, knocking over a small tray and causing a few nearby passengers to jump. "Who do you think you are anyway? Some kind of hero?" It was then that the other passengers noticed him. At first, he seemed just another bystander, quiet, calm, and composed, sitting a few rows ahead. Jeans, an old jacket, a neutral expression. No security, no entourage, no special treatment. Just a man watching the chaos unfold. And yet, something about the way he sat there, completely undisturbed, drew attention. Passengers glanced at each other, whispering, "Do you see that guy? He's not reacting at all." One woman murmured to her friend, "Who is he?" It wasn't long before the drunk noticed him too. His laughter slowed, replaced by a squinting glare. "Hey, aren't you that movie guy?" he slurred, leaning over slightly. "What are you, some kind of tough guy or something?" Even as the drunk ranted and mocked, the silent man remained seated. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, and he didn't flinch. He simply watched, his calmness a stark contrast to the chaos around him. His eyes were sharp, observant, taking in every movement, every tense shift in the cabin, every worried glance of the passengers. Other passengers couldn't help but notice. Phones were discreetly raised to record, some whispering nervously to those around them, others just staring in disbelief. The drunk's energy was dominating the space, yet the man's silent presence seemed to counter it, a subtle tension building in the cabin. Flight attendants moved closer, still attempting to control the situation, but it was clear this wasn't going to end with words alone. The drunk, emboldened by the attention he was getting, began leaning further into the aisle, gesturing wildly, invading the personal space of passengers. Then, the calm man finally shifted slightly in his seat. Not aggressively, not confrontational, just a small movement, enough to make people notice. It was as if the room could feel the change before it happened. A quiet aura of authority emanated from him, and suddenly, even the drunk seemed to sense it, though he didn't yet understand what it meant. The cabin was tense, silent except for the drunk's occasional slurred laugh. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable, a confrontation, an explosion, or some dramatic outburst. And in that moment, it became clear to the passengers that this wasn't just a normal man. He wasn't reacting out of anger, fear, or arrogance. He was calm, deliberate, and completely unshakable. There was a story waiting to unfold, one that no one on this flight would forget. Engagement cue. Comment below if you were sitting there. Would you confront someone being aggressive, or would you stay silent? What would you do if a stranger remained completely calm in a tense situation? The drunken man's antics had reached a new level of recklessness. He was now leaning over the aisle, shouting at passengers, pointing fingers, and laughing as if the entire plane were his personal stage. Drinks were spilling, trays were knocked aside, and some passengers were starting to tense up, gripping their armrests. Others whispered hurriedly to each other, unsure whether to intervene or just stay silent and hope the chaos would pass. Then, his gaze landed on the calm figure sitting a few rows ahead, the man who hadn't moved, hadn't yelled, hadn't even raised an eyebrow in irritation. The drunk's eyes narrowed.
"Hey, aren't you some movie guy?"
He slurred, wobbling slightly as he leaned forward.
"Yeah, that's right."
What are you, some kind of hero or something? Think you can just sit there and ignore me? A few passengers whispered nervously, some giggling under their breath, others holding their phones up to record. The tension in the cabin spiked. The drunk man seemed to feed off the attention, believing that he was in control. He staggered closer, gesturing wildly, invading the personal space of anyone near him.
"I'll teach you a lesson, tough guy,"
he slurred, pointing at the calm man. You think you're better than me, but the man remained seated, not a single muscle tensed in anger or fear. He simply looked at the drunk with calm, assessing his movements like a silent observer studying an erratic predator. His eyes were sharp, steady, and unwavering. He didn't yell, he didn't shove him back, he didn't even flinch. And yet, his presence alone seemed to subtly shift the energy in the cabin. Passengers began to notice. Whispers spread quietly. Who is that? Why isn't he scared? Is that really him? Some pointed discreetly, others moved their cameras closer. Phones shook slightly in trembling hands as passengers tried to capture the moment without drawing attention. The drunk man, oblivious to the effect he was having on the cabin, continued.
"I said move."
Who do you think you are? He swung his arms, nearly knocking over a passenger's drink. Some people flinched, others backed away, but the calm man did nothing but sit there, still and composed. Then in a voice low and deliberate, almost a whisper that cut through the chaos, the calm man spoke. Sometimes arrogance blinds the eyes that should see. The drunk blinked. He staggered slightly, confused by the tone. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't angry, it was calm, measured, and carried a weight he didn't understand. What are you saying? He slurred, his bravado faltering for just a moment. Passengers felt the shift immediately. The air seemed heavier, more tense, as if the cabin itself had drawn a collective breath and paused. Even the flight attendants froze momentarily, sensing something extraordinary about to happen. The drunk man, sensing the attention turning, tried to regain control.
"I don't care who you are. I do what I want,"
he shouted, swinging his arm toward the aisle again. But he was off balance, unsteady, and his confidence wavered for the first time. The calm man rose slowly, deliberately, like a predator moving toward its target with complete awareness. Each step was measured, controlled. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just moved forward, letting the drunk feel the weight of the room's collective attention. Passengers were frozen in their seats. Phones hovered in mid-air, some ready to record, some shaking in hands. The drunk now hesitated, mid-step, realizing for the first time that he wasn't in control. His energy, once dominating, was being quietly dismantled by the calm authority of a man who refused to react with aggression. Every eye in the cabin was on the two men. A hush fell over the rows, broken only by the occasional gasp or whisper. The drunk man's arrogance began to crumble under the pressure of silent scrutiny. And yet, the calm man did nothing to force the situation. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't touch him, and he didn't provoke fear. He simply stood, measured and composed, radiating an invisible power that everyone in the cabin could feel. The tension was palpable. It was clear to everyone that something extraordinary was unfolding, that the next few seconds could change everything in that small, confined space. The drunk man, who had thought himself unstoppable, now faced the presence of someone far beyond his understanding, someone who didn't need to fight to command respect. Engagement cue. Before we continue, comment below. If you were on that plane, would you step in to confront the drunk passenger? Or would you stay silent? Could you remain calm if someone was challenging you directly? The cabin had fallen completely silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background as the tension reached its peak. Passengers held their breath, staring wide-eyed at the scene unfolding in the aisle. The drunk man, who had moments ago dominated the space with his slurred shouting, now looked unsure, off balance, and suddenly very aware that the room had turned against him. Steven Seagal, calm and collected, began to move down the narrow aisle. Every step was deliberate, measured, as if the floor beneath him knew the gravity of his presence. He didn't rush, he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't make any sudden movements. Yet, with every inch he advanced, the energy in the cabin shifted. The drunk man flailed slightly, gesturing wildly, but his gestures now seemed clumsy, ineffective. He could feel that the power dynamic had changed, not through force, but through sheer presence. Passengers watched, frozen in awe. Some held their phones up, recording every moment. Others whispered, amazed at the contrast, the chaos and loud arrogance of one man versus the composed, unshakable authority of another. "Who is he?" murmured a woman to her friend. "Is that really him?" The drunk tried one last attempt to reclaim control. "You think you can intimidate me? I don't care who you are," he slurred, leaning forward aggressively. His words lacked conviction now, even he could feel the shift in attention. The entire cabin had turned, subtly but unmistakably, against him. Steven didn't respond immediately. He simply tilted his head slightly, letting the drunk realize that his presence alone was enough to command silence. His eyes met the man's, steady, unwavering, and for the first time the drunk faltered. He staggered back a step, his bravado cracking under the weight of calm authority. Passengers' reactions were almost audible. A few gasped, some whispered quietly. One elderly woman clutched the armrest, her knuckles white, eyes wide as if she were witnessing a force beyond comprehension. A child sitting nearby peeked nervously, sensing that something important was happening, even if he didn't understand what it was. Flight attendants hovered, unsure of how to intervene further. They had dealt with unruly passengers before, but nothing like this. The drunk's energy, once dominant, now seemed ridiculous in comparison to the quiet control of the man walking toward him. And then, as if to punctuate the moment, Steven made a small, deliberate movement. He leaned slightly, sidestepping the drunk's flailing arm, redirecting his momentum with minimal effort. The drunk stumbled slightly, confused, unsure what had just happened. For the first time, he was completely disoriented. Passengers began whispering in astonishment. "Did you see that? He didn't even touch him. What is going on?" The atmosphere was electric, a tense mix of fear, awe, and admiration. People were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The drunk man froze completely. Every eye in the cabin was on him. His earlier confidence and loudness had evaporated, replaced with uncertainty and embarrassment. He realized too late that he had underestimated the quiet man in front of him. Steven Seagal returned to his calm stance, standing just a few feet away. His presence alone seemed to drain the drunken man of any remaining energy or arrogance. Passengers exhaled slowly, realizing that the crisis had passed, yet the lesson had been unmistakable. Respect and authority do not always come from loudness or aggression. Sometimes, they come from restraint, control, and silent confidence. The drunk man, now utterly defeated in spirit, sank back into his seat. Passengers slowly began to move again, some still whispering to each other, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Even the flight attendants, relieved, exchanged glances as if to say, "That just happened." And through it all, Steven remained calm, seated again, observing the reactions around him with a faint, knowing smile. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted completely. Where moments ago there had been chaos and intimidation, now there was silence, respect, and awe. Every passenger, whether they had been actively watching or just caught glimpses, understood they had witnessed something rare, a demonstration of control and authority without aggression. And they knew, deep down, that the lesson of those few tense seconds would linger long after the plane landed. If you were sitting there on that plane, would you have intervened? The cabin was silent, almost reverent, as the drunk passenger slumped back into his seat, utterly defeated. But the tension in the air hadn't fully dissipated. Every passenger was still holding their breath, staring at the calm man who had just dismantled chaos with nothing more than composure and quiet authority. There was a collective sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Then, it happened. A soft vibration reverberated through the cabin floor, not the engines, not the turbulence, but the subtle movement of passengers craning their necks to see what was coming. A flight attendant approached the calm man cautiously, still unsure what to say, but before she could speak, his attention shifted elsewhere. A black, sleek car had been waiting on the tarmac, visible through the plane's small window. The sudden arrival of 3 executives carrying briefcases and official-looking documents made passengers shift in their seats, murmuring to one another in confusion. "What's happening? Who are they?" The executives hurried down the aisle, weaving past passengers with purpose. "Mr. Seagal, we've been waiting for you, sir," one of them said, his voice both formal and urgent. The drunk passenger, who had moments ago been the center of the cabin's attention, blinked in disbelief. "You mean, that's him?" His voice trembled, a mixture of fear and incredulity. "Yes," one executive replied with a small nod. "He is the new majority owner of this flight's airline division." A murmur spread through the cabin, growing louder with every second. Passengers whispered to one another. "The calm man, the one who didn't react, he owns the company. All this time, we thought he was just another passenger." The realization hit them hard. What they had assumed was a quiet observer had been someone of enormous authority, someone who could easily command respect without ever raising his voice. The drunk man's face turned red, a mixture of embarrassment and shame. His arrogance, which had dominated the cabin just moments ago, now seemed ridiculous. He had harassed someone who not only had the patience to remain calm under provocation, but also had the power to change the entire situation with minimal effort. Steven Seagal spoke quietly, but every word carried weight. "I came here to remain calm and deposit myself into this cabin. But sometimes, lessons are unavoidable." His eyes scanned the passengers, ensuring they understood without a single act of aggression. Passengers watched in awe as he returned to his seat, subtly radiating authority. The drunk passenger, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, slumped back, silent and ashamed. He realized, painfully, that he had underestimated someone he thought was ordinary. Some passengers laughed nervously, others shook their heads in disbelief, and a few wiped tears from their eyes, not out of sadness, but from the sheer intensity of witnessing someone remain composed in the face of chaos. Phones continued to record, though now they were almost secondary to the overwhelming energy in the cabin. The flight attendants finally regained control, calmly moving through the rows, checking on passengers, and ensuring that the situation had truly de-escalated. Yet even they couldn't hide their astonishment. They had dealt with difficult passengers before, but nothing like this. Engagement cue. Before we continue, comment below: should Steven have forgiven the drunk passenger, or should he have taken stricter action? Type forgive or confront and tell us why. The drunk man, quietly subdued by the weight of the situation, whispered an apology, but it was barely audible over the hum of murmurs. Steven merely nodded once, acknowledging the gesture without fanfare. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to assert dominance. His presence had done everything necessary. Passengers were still whispering among themselves, some replaying the moment in their heads, others sharing videos on social media with captions like, "Unbelievable calm under pressure," or, "This is what respect looks like." Everyone understood that this encounter had been a lesson in humility, patience, and the power of silent authority. As the executives approached to escort him, passengers finally realized the full scope. This man, who had sat quietly, seemingly inconspicuous, had not only diffused a tense situation, but also commanded the room with his sheer presence. The drunk passenger, who had sought attention and dominance, had been completely humbled. Steven Seagal, the calm, unassuming man in the aisle just moments ago, had revealed his true identity, and in doing so, left a mark on everyone in the cabin that no one would forget. The lesson was clear: respect is not demanded through arrogance or aggression, but through composure, presence, and integrity. The tension that had gripped the cabin for the past several minutes began to dissipate. Though the atmosphere remained thick with awe and curiosity, passengers leaned back in their seats, exchanging quiet whispers, replaying the events in their minds. The drunk passenger, now completely humbled, sank further into his chair, his earlier bravado completely gone. The realization of what had just transpired slowly settled on him. He had challenged someone he thought was ordinary, only to discover that he had been in the presence of a man whose calm authority rendered arrogance meaningless. Steven Seagal remained composed, seated quietly, observing the cabin with the faintest of smiles. There was no boastfulness in his demeanor, no need for applause, just the silent strength of someone who knew the value of patience, restraint, and respect. The drunk man's apology, whispered and timid, barely reached the nearby passengers. "I am sorry, sir," he stammered, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't know who you were." Seagal's eyes met his, calm yet piercing. "That's exactly the problem," he replied softly. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to show respect." The simplicity of the statement carried a weight far greater than any confrontation or punishment could have. The entire cabin seemed to absorb the lesson at once: respect is universal, and it is not earned through fear or intimidation, but through consistent integrity and awareness. Passengers shifted, some whispering excitedly to one another, others still holding phones, replaying the moments just witnessed. Flight attendants exchanged glances, quietly impressed by the manner in which the situation had been diffused. No one had needed to raise a hand, yell, or escalate the confrontation. The authority had been communicated silently, yet powerfully through presence alone. The drunk passenger, humbled and chastened, lowered his head. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he muttered, his voice nearly inaudible. There was a sense of shame in his posture, a recognition of his own failings. This wasn't just about being drunk or rude, it was about underestimating someone entirely. Steven stood slowly, moving with the same deliberate calm that had disarmed the chaotic energy moments ago. He approached the flight attendants, giving them a subtle nod of acknowledgement for their efforts. Then he addressed the cabin, his voice measured and soft, yet carrying a clarity that reached every passenger. Moments like this teach us something important. Respect isn't reserved for those in power. It's shown to everyone, especially when we think no one is watching. The passengers absorbed his words, nodding quietly, some murmuring in agreement. There was a collective sense of relief and understanding. The drunk passenger, still seated, looked around at the cabin, at the eyes that had been on him, at the faces that had silently judged and witnessed, at the realization that his behavior had consequences far greater than he had imagined. Seagal's gaze then fell on a flight attendant who had handled the situation with poise throughout. "Your composure was commendable," he said quietly. "From today, your diligence and respect for others will be remembered." There was no fanfare, no dramatic announcement, just a genuine acknowledgement of character. Short audience engagement question: if you were on this flight, who would you have admired most? The calm figure who diffused the chaos, or the attendants who tried their best under pressure? Comment below with your choice. The drunk passenger, now fully aware of the gravity of his actions, whispered another apology. This time there was sincerity in his tone, a recognition of the lesson he had been forced to learn. The cabin, once tense and chaotic, had returned to a state of calm, though the energy had shifted from fear and uncertainty to respect and awe. Passengers continued to murmur quietly among themselves, replaying the events in their minds. Some exchanged glances with others who had witnessed it, a silent acknowledgement that this was not a moment they would forget. Stories would be retold, videos would circulate, and the lesson of restraint and humility would resonate long after the plane touched down. Steven Seagal, having completed his quiet demonstration of authority and patience, returned to his seat, sitting back as if nothing had happened. Yet the impression he left was indelible. He had shown that true strength is not about intimidation, loudness, or aggression. True strength is silent, deliberate, and recognized in the respect it commands. The cabin's atmosphere, now calmer but still charged with admiration, reflected a simple truth: authority and respect are not won through fear. They are earned through restraint, composure, and integrity. And sometimes, those lessons come in just a few tense moments. The plane had returned to its quiet rhythm, the hum of the engines filling the spaces where tension had once dominated. Passengers were still talking quietly among themselves, replaying in their minds the extraordinary series of events that had unfolded just moments ago. What had started as a chaotic confrontation with a drunken passenger had transformed into a lesson in restraint, humility, and the quiet power of respect. Steven Seagal sat calmly in his seat, observing the cabin without arrogance or the need for recognition. His faint smile suggested satisfaction, but it was not the kind of satisfaction that demanded attention. It was the subtle, knowing contentment of someone who understood the true meaning of authority, that it is not shown through force, intimidation, or dominance, but through composure, integrity, and silent confidence. Passengers slowly exhaled, some still whispering about the incredible way the situation had been diffused. The drunk passenger, now fully humbled, kept his head lowered, quietly reflecting on the lesson he had just experienced. The chaos that had seemed unstoppable was now a memory, replaced by a profound realization that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned and observed, and sometimes lessons arrive in unexpected ways. The flight attendants, who had managed the situation with professionalism and patience, now shared knowing glances. They understood what had happened in the cabin wasn't just about controlling a drunk passenger. It was a demonstration of true power, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be felt. The passengers, too, understood. Every whispered conversation, every glance exchanged, carried the silent acknowledgement that they had witnessed something remarkable. Steven finally spoke, his voice calm but resonant enough to reach the cabin. Respect is not something you show only to the powerful, the famous, or those who seem intimidating, he said. It's something you show to everyone, especially when you think no one is watching. His words hung in the air like a quiet lesson that settled into the minds of each passenger. The drunk passenger, who had caused so much disruption, now looked around at the faces of those he had tried to dominate. He saw admiration in some eyes, awe in others, and the undeniable realization that his arrogance had been met with grace rather than confrontation. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that power is not about noise or chaos, it is about presence, patience, and respect. Passengers slowly began to return to their own activities, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a newfound appreciation for calm authority, for restraint, and for humility. Even the youngest passengers, who had only partially understood what had occurred, could feel the weight of the lesson. The most powerful actions are often those done quietly, with integrity. Engagement queued. If you believe humility is real strength, type RESPT in the comments below. And tell me, which moment on this flight amazed you the most? Your answers help us create even better stories for you. Steven Seagal remained seated, a quiet presence that spoke volumes. His lesson had been delivered without anger, without aggression, and without drama. It had been simple, yet profound. True strength is silent, and true respect is earned through character, not fear. As the plane continued its journey, passengers reflected on the experience. Some whispered to their neighbors, sharing the lesson in hushed tones. Others stared out the window, contemplating the idea that respect and humility could be more powerful than chaos and arrogance. The drunk passenger, now silent and thoughtful, understood a truth that would likely stay with him for a lifetime. And as the plane cruised steadily toward its destination, there was a collective sense that the events of those few tense minutes had left an indelible mark. The lesson was clear: respect, humility, and quiet strength are far more impactful than loudness, arrogance, or aggression. The cabin had returned to calm, but the memory of the encounter lingered. Passengers would share the story with friends and family, recounting how one man's composure transformed a chaotic moment into a lesson in life. And while the plane continued toward its destination, the wisdom of those moments would travel far beyond the confines of the cabin. True strength is silent, true respect is earned, and sometimes the most important lessons arrive in just a few tense, unforgettable seconds.